Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. I'm Rosa Lisarde, the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force. And on behalf of myself and Emilia Reyes of Equidad de Género, the co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, I welcome you to today's webinar, Global Processes and the Future of Humanity, our seventh in the series of macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet. We began this series looking at the financial impacts of COVID on the lives of women and girls, their families, and their communities. And we looked at this on various levels and found that COVID-19 has been a magnifier of pre-existing and underlying conditions, creating multiple layered crisis impacting women and girls. On the issue of debt, we call for complete debt cancellation. On tax, we call for progressive tax solutions to ensure redistributive justice for women and girls and all. On the care economy, we see that women are bearing a disproportionate brunt of the healthcare costs through sustaining the care economy and the division of labor. On trade, it's not just about free trade, but fair trade and equitable rules on intellectual property rights. On climate change, we call for system change, complete system change, and a Green New Deal. The results for women have been a multi-layered crisis impacting their lives, their communities, and their families. Through these webinars, feminist activists and experts are painting a fuller picture and analysis of the gender dimensions of trade, tax, debt, intellectual property rights, the climate emergency, a Green New Deal, and how the care economy impacts women and girls, where the burden disproportionately falls on their shoulders. Today's webinar on global processes will look further into the wider systemic issues and global governance dynamics by looking at three independent yet very related processes: the binding treaty on transnational corporations and other business enterprises and its status and potential for curbing and taming multinational corporations using human rights instruments; the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and the call for democratization of the multilateral space in the economic and financial spheres. And we're going to look at the dynamics of the G20 and the challenges and contradictions to maneuver within this area of global governance. We do this in the context of a recent launch during the UN High-Level Political Forum, calling for an International Economic Reconstruction and Systemic Reform Summit under the auspices of the UN, where in fact the system remains the only place where developing countries are at the table with one country, one vote. We want to build momentum and mobilization where we push for reforms towards a global consensus on a new economic governance architecture that could foster systemic reforms while promoting human rights, gender equality, social equity, and environmental justice. Of course, we need everyone's help for this. And so we will ask you to stay engaged and participate in this process. For now, let us move to our panel without further delay. First, we're going to begin with the treaty, international binding treaty. Our first speaker is Alejandra Scampini, who I'm privileged to call a friend and a longtime feminist partner in the Gender Equality to End Poverty agenda. Alejandra is the Strategic Engagement Advisor for the Project on Organizing, Development, Education, and Research, otherwise known as PODER by its acronym in Spanish, which means power in English. She has been a longtime member of DAWN, the Development Alternatives for Women in the New Era. Ale is calling in from Uruguay, her home, and will speak to us on the binding treaty. The floor is yours, Alejandra.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosa. Can you hear me? Yes? Can you hear me? Oh, great. Thank you very much. So, yeah, it's great to be surrounded by friends. I would like to thank the Women Working Group, especially Rosa Lisarde and Emilia Reyes, for inviting Poder to this space. We also would like to use the time to congratulate you, to congratulate the Women Working Group for being selected global leaders of the Generation Equality Action Coalitions to Accelerate Gender Equality. I think it's a privilege for Poder also to be coming into this conversation with you. And I was asked to reflect on the importance of this legal binding treaty on transnational corporations and other business in relation to human rights, and also encourage you to join this global and feminist movement towards the binding treaty. But before that, I would like to put you a little bit into the perspective and uniqueness of the time. Just a month ago, Poder was invited to participate in a high-level panel of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. This panel was chaired by Germany, and the title was very important. It was ensuring that business respects human rights during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. And they tapped on the relevance of one of the mechanisms, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this space was very relevant, and I would like to quote part of the message of the statement that they delivered, that said that the global pandemic and the economic crisis inevitably following its wake have become an unprecedented test for governments and business not to lower human rights standards. It's more vital than ever for governments and business alike to take a sustainable, people-centered path while fighting COVID-19 and trying to keep economies afloat. So this was an important space to remind the role of states in ensuring responsible business conduct during the crisis and the recovery. Also, the second pillar that was also refreshed is that business have to respect human rights and it's mission critical during the crisis and for a resilient recovery. And finally, the need to access the need for access remedy for victims of business-related human rights. So these are moments in which are important, these events, these high-level moments, to really ensure that there is commitment, there is expression of interest to keep high standards, especially in times of COVID, when the private sector and the business community are called to play a critical role. And in this recovery period, it's important to see, the opportunities to take a more sustainable path towards putting people and the planet at the center. And I'm sure many of you here in this presentation today will be recalling different member states or leaders of UN agencies talking about, the importance of the recovery period. So this is also a moment, not just to make promises that sometimes we are still very suspicious, but also to remind of unfulfilled promises and to remind violations, to remind pending agendas. And this year also in Poder, we celebrate, and it's hard to say celebrate, but we commemorate a 6th year anniversary of the toxic spill at a Buenavista cobre mine that contaminated the Sonora River in northern Mexico. The company responsible for what is considered the worst environment disaster in national mining history communities they still enjoy impunity according to the victims. In 2014, maybe some of you remember, as Pilar Buenavista del Cobre mine at Cananea sent 40,000 cubic meters of acid copper sulfate into the Bacanuchi and Sonora rivers, leaving 22,000 inhabitants of 7 municipalities without drinking water or ways to make a living. Despite all the efforts, and Poder supports this community to get justice and repair, the environmental disaster is still unsolved. The federal government continues to allow the powerful Grupo Mexico to expand its activities, its mining operations, and the inhabitants are still, marginalized and kicked off of several processes and battles against the transnational company. So the COVID responses are also a remind of what's not going so well. And as Rosa was saying in the presentation, are serving as a magnifying lens on deep fractures and inequalities in societies and on the dismantling of public services that are vital, rights such as healthcare, the benefits, and how corporates are benefited from this situation. I'm sure in many of your contexts, there are massive job losses, there are breakdowns of informal economies. The COVID, again, has revealed why we resist the current political economy systems that are connected so much to a deepened history of patriarchy, discrimination, and economic systems that are connected to also to these power entities and companies. So in some of the studies and documentations that we have done as members of the ESCRnet and also with Poder, we are seeing how in the COVID context, the abuses of corporations continue. And those that, for example, provide food or medical supplies are gouging prices in Australia and beyond. For instance, big pharmaceuticals and medical companies are withholding medicines, medical devices, and information due to bidding wars between, countries, leading to high prices of these essential goods. In Kenya, for instance, a group documented that 40,000 workers have been sent home on compulsory leave and unpaid leave. In Mexico, for instance, Grupo Salinas, who owns Banco Azteca, Tiendas Eléctrica in Mexico, announced publicly, and this is how they say, they will remain open to save Mexico in times of pandemic. The same situation we can find in Cambodia, where there is a group called Equitable Cambodia that describes that as part of semi-lockdown, the Cambodia government issued instructions that government workers are not allowed to leave their work during New Year, or they will not be able to pay for the public holiday. So these are just examples of how are the demands for a day after tomorrow require our strength as a movement to ensure corporate accountability and a future that prioritizes rights of people over profits. Amidst immense injustices and suffering, the current crisis opens also an opportunity. And we think to radically rethink, as Rosa was saying, to create a new narrative, to refound social relationships among movements, to choose an exit from the crisis that is not, build back better, but to really think a different tomorrow with greater justice, equality, freedom, and solidarity. So the characteristics of these abuses and violations of human rights that I described, including labor rights and also environmental disasters, what they have in common is that you have a main client of the local company that is one or various companies based in another country in the north that is develop a transnational activity, and the local company is part of the supply chain. Also, in many of these cases, from the Sonora case to all these cases of abuses during COVID times, what we see is that the parent company announces, or the companies, at local level, what they announce is that they are respecting standards of human rights and labor standards, environmental audits. But they do not really reflect what is in the reality. In many also of the audits that they present, they don't reflect the reality of how, the conditions of work or how they are really impacting the environment. And also what is common to all these cases is that the victims, once, you have the catastrophe, they don't have an easy access to justice nor to remedies. And when you have it, it's just a consequence of a very specific, conjuncture or specific situation. So all these examples, what provide us is, certain conclusions that lead us to, why we are behind this legally binding instrument and pushing so much and trying to get solidarity from other movements. First of all, in spite of all the many advances and all the messages that we hear in different panels and different voluntary guidelines, the abuses and violations of human rights from the part of transnational corporations and also from the part of, local companies and national companies have not reduced. What we are documenting is that it is even worse, and sometimes, more often than we would like, with the compliance of the state. Also, what we are seeing is that these violations and abuses, even if there are these enormous amount of voluntary guidelines, new codes of conduct, new business saying that they would like, to learn more about human rights, what we see is that they still depend on the will of the company. And this is not enough. So also there are still obstacles, and we see, and the excuse of the COVID is used as an excuse also to put more obstacles for the victims to access justice and remedies. And more often than not, what we see is harassment to victims, lack of access to information, denial of the right to express, to free speech. So the circumstances are not getting ease for any of the situations. So what we are seeing is that, and of course, nothing that I have just said may be new for you, is it's revitalizing what we have been denouncing and saying for so many years as part of many movements. In view of this reality, what we need, and we say it very clearly in numerous statements, is to go beyond the voluntary guidelines. We really acknowledge that there has been improvement, that there are some cases in France and now in other countries where there are movements towards due diligence laws. We recognize that, but we need to go beyond this voluntary paradigm. We need to look for legally binding instruments that is sustained. This is our sustained claim that has been long informed, analyzed, and by hundreds of organizations, associations of victims, associations of peoples and communities. Looking forward, what we say is that there is no time for business as usual. Business and investment as usual is not an option anymore. Enough is enough, as we say with ESCRnet members, and we need to halt corporate abuse that put lives and sustainability at risk. We would like to invite you to be part of a global movement towards corporate accountability, towards a legally binding instrument. We are in the 6th year of this process since the foundation, since the starting point of the working group for the legally binding treaty that was launched in 2014 by Ecuador, South Africa, and it had at that time, 6 years ago, a great momentum from many of the member states in the South. We are on the verge in October for our 6th session of this legally binding instrument. We are happy to see that the new draft that was just released a week ago has improved in terms of clarity, in terms of putting the stress on victims, on prevention, on putting also issues like free, prior, informed consent that was vital for indigenous communities, for putting also the responsibility of the state to really protect this legally binding instrument from trade and investment agreements that you may agree with me that today are the conditionals that we have at the back of any of these agreements. So it is important to see this legally binding instrument as an opportunity to connect with trade unions, because this binding treaty puts workers' rights before profits in recovery measures. It is an important instrument also to think about taxing big corporations and prioritize funding for nationalized health systems and any public service system. So this is a time for the communities that are talking about protecting public services and really tax and put the burden now to big corporates. This is also a time to protect decision making from governments, from the power of the elites. This is a time for using the legally binding instrument to stop corporate capture. So all of you that are looking to protect decision-making processes, development debates from the influence of corporates, please look at the legal binding treaty also as an instrument in your activism. And finally, finally, I want to tell you that this is a time to really hold impunity and power. Not just about, this business, textile, or related to energy, or this is also a time to look at the big platforms, the ones that are proposing a future of labor that is, electronic. We need to look at, the platforms that today are even bigger. These bigger platforms like Amazon and Google, these are bigger than the companies that today we are also being challenging. So if you want to continue with the global campaign or the Feminists for Binding Treaty who are looking at the gender impacts of these agreements, please contact us, and I will leave you also my address. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandra. That was a wonderful analysis, really connecting a lot of the different issues, and especially the environmental impacts as you started out. And we know that currently we're seeing the devastation of the MV Wakashio ship on the coastline of Mauritius, dumping over 1,000 tons of oil into the ocean. So very salient points on this issue. Thank you so much. And I want to encourage people who have questions to please write your questions in the YouTube chat box, and we will receive them and we can direct them to the panelists. We're going to move on to Emma Burgesser, who is the Gender Project Manager at the Bretton Woods Project. Emma has led the Gender Equality and Macroeconomics Project as the manager since 2017 and has been with the Bretton Woods Project's interim IMF lead, leading it twice. And before joining the Bretton Woods Project, Emma worked in Geneva as the international coordinator for the Women's Power to Stop War campaign and human rights program with the WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So we're thrilled that you can bring a lot of these different perspectives. Emma, she's joining us from London. So Emma, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosa, for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really, have been looking forward to this discussion for a while. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege. So I'm going to have, I have a little slideshow just to make sure to add a few facts for people who might be less familiar with the Bretton Woods institutions. I'm just going to do a very quick refresher for those of you that maybe don't work so much on the IMF and World Bank. There's a few basics there on the screen for you to see, but the thing I really want to sort of emphasize and really focus for this conversation is that, we really think the IMF and the World Bank are incredibly influential players when it comes to macroeconomic policy for the IMF and international development policy for the World Bank. As their role as major creditors and in the power that they have to set conditionality in their loan programs to decide what economic policies countries should be putting in place to receive financing. These are really, really, really important, powerful players and really set the norm for what is acceptable economic and development policy worldwide. So that's why groups like the Bretton Woods Project focus on them and monitor them. For the purpose of this discussion, I just wanted to highlight in particular their governance structure, in case anyone didn't know, or in case maybe people thought this might have changed in recent years. So that both the IMF and World Bank are still run under a system called a quota system, which is often called $1, one vote, in opposition to one country, one vote, as is the case with a lot of UN organizations and UN bodies. And it means that effectively Western large economies have a much larger vote on the boards of these institutions than developing countries do, right? And so, for example, the UK alone has its own board member on the board of the IMF, and they represent about 4% of the IMF's vote share. In contrast, all sub-Saharan African countries together get 2 board members, and they represent about the same amount of vote share. So it's really important when you're talking about the IMF and World Bank to understand that developing countries are structurally underrepresented in their decision making, and so that's obviously a huge problem when we're talking about democratizing multilateral spaces. And then if you turn to, what they do with that power and what kind of policies we're talking about, I think most of you will already know. So I'm not going to explain, the Washington Consensus, but I just, again, want to reiterate that this idea of hollowing out the public sector in favor of the private sector and increasingly the financial sector is still what these institutions are very much doing every single day. The World Bank has just adopted a few years ago a new approach called maximizing finance for development that explicitly privileges the private sector over the public sector in development, while the IMF continues in all its loan programs and all its policy advice to really focus on strict fiscal consolidation or austerity measures, right? And so together, that policy mix we see as structurally undermining women's rights and gender equality and exacerbating the feminization of poverty, not just, over the last few decades, but again, this is still happening basically every single day. So that's really important to take away from this. So if we then look at, how that relates to the IMF and World Bank's COVID responses, I think in the beginning when this started happening really and started expanding in March and April, both institutions really went on emergency response mode. And what that looked like for them is really trying to get as much money out of the door as quickly as possible. And, that's makes some sense because we saw a huge, absolutely unprecedented outflow of capital coming out of developing countries at the time, while governments needed to spend more on their health and social protection, while their economies were being locked down, right? So there was this huge need for financing to happen very quickly, and both the bank and fund have been trying to get the money out of the door effectively. But there are some major problems with that. So first, of course, with it happening so fast, the quality and oversight and accountability of how these decisions are being made is really a big cause for concern. The just to give you a sense, so normally the IMF gets about 2 to 3 requests for financing from countries, every quarter or so. This time they got over 100 requests for financing in just 1 month. So just to give you a sense of how sort of in overdrive these institutions are now working. But more importantly, maybe than the accountability is two main issues, right? Is the first that the money that they're able to disperse at the moment is just plainly nowhere near enough. The amount is just not anywhere near what has been estimated by various groups that these countries need. And in part, that is because there was this discussion that I know you've discussed a bit in some of these previous webinars about whether there should be an allocation of SDRs, special drawing rights, this type of currency that the IMF maintains, that basically means that with the stroke of a pen, governments could get money very quickly to every country in the world, basically. And that didn't happen in April because the US blocked it. Almost every country was in favor for it, and the US blocked it, right? And so that alone to me means that, it's an ultimate sign of how broken our system is today when just one country can block that happening for every other country in the world. So it's not enough, but also very importantly, most of this money going out of the door are loans, right? And not grants. And so that means that they're adding to the debt that a lot of these countries already had a lot of before COVID. And so what it does is effectively kicking this problem of debt down the road and creating a much bigger debt crisis that we see is definitely coming and ahead of us. But not only that, I think what it also does is it will make a lot of countries have to go back to the IMF very soon when the emergency financing runs out and when the debt relief runs out. They'll be coming back to the IMF for new programs, new loans that will be much longer. They will be like 3 or 4 years long. They'll be full of conditionality and full of austerity again. And so, we really see that as a major threat to what is about to come. And we're really concerned about it because it's already happening. So the IMF has already started approving a few new loan programs that are full-time, like full-length loan programs that will go on until 2024, where countries are already agreeing to start going back to austerity by the end of this year and by early next year. And not just the same austerity that they were on track to do before COVID, but sort of the austerity at twice the speed, right? Because they have to make up for all that spending that they've just done during COVID. So that's what we're extremely concerned about. And because what it does is effectively, while we're all talking about how COVID can bring, transformative change, what is already happening without many people noticing is the IMF is already locking in a bunch of new countries into many years of austerity that will effectively just preclude, the idea of feminist economies or gender equal economies. So that's what we're really worried about. So that gets us just to the end of, what do we do with this as activists, as feminists? And the question was posed, how do the IMF and World Bank relate to democratizing multilateral space? And effectively, I just think they don't fundamentally because of the way their governance is structured. Unless that changes, I really don't see a way to democratize the fund and bank in any meaningful way, right? And so that leaves us with these questions like, what do we do with that? And so I think from what we see as the Bretton Woods Project, we see these sort of 3 types of activities that we see civil society groups engage in that we think are very worthwhile, right? So the first is just monitoring and raising awareness, monitoring these institutions, because just understanding what the IMF or World Bank is saying to your government and what conversations they're having, how your government is responding, it's just very important to understand what's going on, right? At a national level, but also at the international level. So continuing to be aware of these institutions, what they're up to and their processes, we think is absolutely critical. then you have this second sort of area of work, which is I consider basically an effort at damage control or limiting the worst harms. So this is for groups who choose to basically engage with the IMF and the World Bank, who talk to them, who try to convince them with arguments and reports or media or whatever to get them to change at least some of their policies that do the most harm. And I think in many ways that's really important work, because even being able to change like a tiny bit of one IMF program or one IMF policy can have these really big impacts on people. But at the same time, I think it's important to sort of engage in that type of work with eyes wide open, that doesn't really change the status quo and is not fundamentally transformative, right? So there are many groups that maybe have to engage at that level because it's kind of the only thing they can do at the moment. Yeah, and so what we're seeing, for example, a lot of women's groups and feminist groups have engaged in those terms with the IMF on trying to get them to conduct gender impact assessments of their economic reforms. So I'll be happy to talk about that if people are interested. And moving towards annual meetings now in October, I think the number one issue will be their medium to long-term COVID responses and whether they're going to change their mind on any of their conventional policy advice. And we've asked them this question, is COVID making you rethink any of like what you have been doing all this time that has led us to this point? And the answer has been really clearly no. So I think that will be a lot of where the momentum is in October during annual meetings with civil society. And finally, so I think that leads us to this final area of work, which, I think as feminists, if we're going to talk about transforming power, I think you fundamentally have to ask these questions about how to shift power away from these institutions, right? And get them in, get these conversations and decision-making into spaces that are much more democratic. And there have been different ways people have approached those sorts of questions. Some groups choose for that exact reason not to engage with the IMF and World Bank at all. Others, we've seen historic campaigns that demanded for both institutions to close their doors. And I think what we're seeing now, which I think is in many ways a much more sort of sophisticated approach, is these calls for creating other institutions that effectively would take away a lot of the power of the bank and fund. So, for example, I know you talked about a UN debt workout mechanism in your debt webinar. So if that were to actually be created, it would effectively take away a lot of the role and power of the IMF. Just like in the way that having a UN tax body would effectively take away a lot of power of the OECD, another, rich country club, right? And so whether it's about talking and proposing new institutions, or whether it's about defending the ones that exist and their independence and their power, like FFD or the CEDAW committee or UNCTAD, those are all really important sort of counterweights, I think, to the power of the fund and bank that we, have sort of to play with as activists and as advocates, right? But to do that well, I think we need, as the civil society community, to be much better connected across these different spaces. And so that's why I'm really happy to be having this conversation with you all. And I look forward to the discussion. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was a lot of information. I think also it was information really kind of bringing us up to date, but also some basic information. And you brought up a lot of points that really cross-fertilize with the work that we're doing on systemic reform at the UN. So I see a couple of questions coming in, but maybe we can get back to you on also these efforts that you mentioned with Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, around pushing for more gender equality and issues with more gender perspective within the IMF, which sounds like a really uphill struggle, but that's something that we'll come back to in the Q&A. So I want to move on to our next speaker, Stefano Prato. If you can join us. Welcome. Thank you, Stefano. Stefano is the managing director of the Society for International Development. He's also the editor of SID's quarterly journal, Development. We know he wears many hats. He has been the coordinator of the Civil Society Financing for Development Group for some years, leading us through Doha and Addis and continuing now. And he's also the co-chair of the steering group of the UN High-Level Political Forum, Major Groups and Other Stakeholders Coordination Mechanism. He wears many capellos, if I'm saying that correctly, many hats. Today, we would like for him to talk about the recent work that he's doing around the G20 and the C20, but also, you have a wealth of knowledge and really could connect a lot of these issues, which I mentioned. They're independent, but of course, very, very related. So we welcome you from Roma, yes, Italy. Stefano, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Rosa, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let me first thank the Women's Working Group for this very, very kind invitation, which I was very excited to join. So I'm gonna use my few minutes to do two things. The first one is I will address a little bit the role of the G20, which is, I must admit, not my most favorite topic, but nevertheless, it's important in the context of this crisis. And then I will just try and draw some conclusions on the challenges that we have as civil society in organizing in this particular phase. Rosa, please stop me when I reach my time to make sure we have sufficient time for the discussion. So in terms of the G20, I'll just focus on 4 points. First, a very brief history. I think it's important to understand where it comes from. Initially, the G20 originates as a meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors. So it wasn't meeting at the leaders level, just to advance discussion and coordination on macroeconomic and financial issues. And I think it dates back to 1999, actually, has initial establishment. But it's only at the wake of the last financial crisis in 2008, in which the G20 was elevated to a leaders meeting between member countries. And it was an explicit attempt by the United States to avoid a too powerful conversation in the UN context around the crisis. There was a moment in which there was a lot of ideas consolidating around a crisis conference under the umbrella of the financing for development process. In a sense, it was still coming from the energy of the Monterey Consensus. And that crisis conference actually happened in June 2009, but to some extent, its impact and its importance was decreased by the fact that the first leaders meeting at the G20 level happened in November 2008. So I'm just mentioning this because it's important to recognize the genesis of the G20 in the context of a crisis and its attempt from the very beginning to generate a counter space to the United Nations. Now, from that moment on, the G20 agenda initially focused very heavily on financial regulatory issues, but then it expanded to socio-economic and development. Now, my second point is related to the notion of governance, that the establishment of these leaders level G20 summit and related work stream generates. Of course, you've all heard the story that the G20 represents 90% of economic output, 2/3 of the world population, 75% of trade. But in reality, it's always important to recognize that we're talking about a structure that has a huge democratic deficit. It's basically a system of governance of the winners, of the most powerful. And if our primary challenge is that of tackling structural inequalities, the G20 is at the core of very many political economies, and therefore it is about preserving the status quo. It is not about changing it. The second important element of its notion of governance beyond the democratic deficit is that, in fact, it's a coordination space. It certainly has normative value, but it doesn't have jurisdiction. Technically, it cannot approve decisions which may be binding. It can only provide, guidelines for its members to align, and that means that it needs to always work through the existing infrastructure. Largely the Bretton Woods institutions and others. In some case, it can also create new institutions. The latest is the Financial Stability Board, which was basically an evolution of the Financial Stability Forum, which was pre-existing, and it was created in 2009, again, as a response of the crisis, but that reproduces within matters of financial regulation exactly the same premises of the G20. No jurisdiction, space for coordination, democratic deficits. What is also worrying in terms of this sort of notion of governance is that from its almost exclusive and explicit reference to regulating global finance in the wake of the crisis, it has expanded virtually to every area of socio-economic and development impact. But it has a tendency of working through its own initiatives rather than reinforcing and strengthening multilateral initiatives, particularly in the UN context. So you can understand that it's virtually a parallel, or rather not even parallel, because within its context is considered an apex governance body on matters of economic governance, but increasingly on all other concerns. So it's certainly a very challenging notion of governance from our viewpoint. Now, unfortunately, this has been the primary, and this is my third point, it has been the primary space for the economic and financial response on COVID. Its algorithm is always the same. I think Emma already explained it well when she spoke about the Washington or the Wall Street consensus. Is always that is based on the fact that tax is related to the OECD BEPS initiative. When we're talking about a debt, we refer to the Paris Club and therefore to a creditor-based system. When we look at financial regulation, we look at the Financial Stability Board. It's focused on leveraging private finance and using large infrastructure as a both economic stimulus, but also as an asset class. So, there's no very many anchoring point for us. But unfortunately, this is the space in which ministries of finance, treasuries, and central bank primarily operate, while they continue to neglect the UN space, which they consider somehow of a talking shop. Now, of course, this means that this is where, in many respects, key economic decisions, whether formally or informally, continue to be made, with all that inadequacy that I have explained before. And it continues to be focused on the current architecture with very little stimulus, very little pressure to change or modernize or democratize global economic governance. So to conclude, what's in it for us as civil society engagement? Well, in my view, it is not our space, and it will never be. At least from the point of view of progressive civil society movements, which are concerned with an anti-colonial response, a process of democratization of economic governance, and they are concerned with justice at many levels. However, it is a space that we cannot leave to its own device. Why? Because what has happened in the past is that civil society that organized around the G20 have been very partial, and some, in many respects, have echoed the G20 demands rather than being consistent with the broader economic justice demands in other spaces, including the UN and Bretton Woods institutions. So one primary and important reason for engagement is that we need to build coherence across spaces to be able to say the same things and advocate for the same key reforms in all spaces, not because there's any chance that they can get approved in the G20, but it's important that in the G20 there's no space for comfort, and in which we may actually echo or simply be friendly to power in that particular space. Now, it's also a cold shower moment, because it's a moment in which we realize that even for many of us who work in the UN context, and sometimes we feel that some decisions are close because we feel a little bit of empathy and sympathy and solidarity from maybe Southern delegates to the UN assemblies. It's actually a space in which we recognize that this is really very far from truth when you confront the very orthodox positions of the ministries of finance. But the problem is that these orthodox positions are very often hidden under this opaque system, and therefore our role is to make those positions more transparent and more evident, because then it's easier to attack them. Of course, we also recognize that in that space there is often a tension between those organizations that consider it as a campaigning space, in particular some, I call them international NGOs with affinity to power, and those that actually want to use that space as a space to condemn and expose the shortcomings of orthodoxies. So, in a nutshell, it is not our space, but it's a space that we cannot leave to its own device. We need to continue to engage with to expose the limitations of its model of governance. Let me then take the last couple of minutes I have to do some general considerations on what are the challenges ahead of us, particularly for those that want to organize on social, economic, and climate justice and gender justice domains. Well, I see a lot of people very excited by the moment because they think that this is now the moment to come, and I'm afraid that this is not the case. I think it's true that the emperor is naked and many things have been exposed and magnified, but its capacity to grow a new colorful school has no rivals. And this is exactly what is happening. We have seen actually the continuation, even with stronger force and power, and therefore this is actually an age of resistance. And against that age of resistance, we are completely unorganized. And both in terms of our politics, of our leadership, our segregation, our ambiguous tendency to engage into multi-stakeholderism, and the tension between the local and the global. So unfortunately, I don't have time to elaborate on this, but my feeling is that we need to recognize that this is now an age for resistance, and therefore we need to organize for resistance. We don't organize for wins, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano, for that brilliant. I'm hearing an echo. I hope that people can fix that. That brilliant analysis. I mean, you leave us with the big question at the very end. We're in a time of resistance and we're completely unorganized. Thank you for highlighting the issue of the complicated relationship of the G20 within this global architecture. It is something that we have to grapple with in a form of resistance, opposition, and as you state, there's a very, very big need to build coherence around this. I think this brought up and connected very many issues. I want to go to Diana, our respondent, who we know will be able to tie and highlight a lot of these issues. So let me introduce our respondent. Diana Yahaya is an independent feminist research and activist from Malaysia. Let me just ask the tech team. I am hearing some static. And okay, thank you. I think that was coming from Diana, and we'll try to fix that. But thank you. Sorry, let me go on with your introduction. She's an independent feminist activist and researcher from Malaysia, and is the outgoing program officer of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women in Law and Development, APWLD, the region's leading network of feminist organizations and activists in the Asia Pacific region. For more than a decade, she has worked as a local, national, and Asia Pacific, regional, and global level to undertake research, carry out advocacy on laws and policies, build capacity, and strengthen movements to challenge traditional models of development. We are thrilled to have Diana. The floor is yours. Thank you for joining.
Right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever all of you are. I am so happy and pleased to have this opportunity to have this conversation with all of you today in terms of discussing, both the state of our multilateralism and where do we go from here. And so as a respondent today, I'm going to be taking up from some of the points that Alejandra, Emma, as well as Stefano had actually shared and expounded upon. And I think it was great that our, previous speakers had sort of given a number of parallel multilateral spaces with the human rights system that Ali was sharing, and that I think many of us are also engaged with, as well as the IFIs, the international financial institutions, and then all the other domains of the economic, where our economic rules and policies effectively gets made in. And these systems, I think when we look back at it and kind of reflect on it, they are in parallel and they're supposed to be complementary, but they are in fact actually contradictory, because you have the human rights system where the goal is to achieve human rights. And then you have the other multilateral system, whether it would be the financial institutions or the banks, whether it would be trade, which primary goal is not human rights, as we can see, and we've heard from other speakers as well, but where the primary goal is really to create the primacy of market as well as capital, and how to achieve market efficiency, and how to ensure that capital has absolute free movements and no control or regulation whatsoever, right? And so these contradictions that we've seen in the multilateral system, and how it's in opposition with each other in some of those cases, and not just in the goals, but also in a lot of those power relationship as well as power dynamics that I think a lot of the earlier speakers have actually shared about. Like, we hear a lot about the dynamics of the power between states, and especially as we do live in both the post-colonial and in fact in some cases still occupied world, and what that means for the inequality of power as well as wealth and resources between states, between actors as well. When we operate in many of this multilateral system, you have movements, civil society, grassroots activists literally being pit against, large multinational corporations whose economy, wealth, as well as power in many cases are easily much more larger than that of many of our countries and our governments. And then, of course, as I earlier mentioned, the system itself, when you have the human rights system with its primary goal, which is to achieve human rights, and the other systems which make our economic rules and policies, whose primary goal is often not at all considering all of the human rights implications. And then I also kind of just wanted to add on a little bit more using the example of the trade multilateral system, which is really how a lot of the things that Alejandra mentioned earlier on in terms of like what corporations are actually able to do across border, across global value chain, are essentially allowed or empowered by a lot of the trade as well as investment regimes that we have, particularly under the World Trade Organization, but many also that are taking place outside of the World Trade Organization. And we would imagine that, in a time of crisis such as these, that a lot of these trade rules would take a backseat in order to ensure that governments are able to put forth the best kind of responses for its people in light of the pandemic. And actually, what we've seen is really the opposite, in that, a lot of governments are actually worried that they're not worried. Many of these governments know that they are violating a number of trade and investment rules, as well as regime, in many of the steps and the actions, whether it would be lockdowns, whether it would be, nationalizing many of the privatized public services, privatized health services, with actually be in violations of numerous trade and investment rules, and that they can potentially face consequences on those violations. And so that is also really another illustration of just how much power that sits with many of these institutions and multilateral spaces that makes our economic rules, because if you violate terms and conditions of a trade agreement, you can be subjected to numerous economic sanctions. Government can have their property abroad get taken away. You could easily also be subjected to investment state dispute settlement, where foreign corporations can sue governments in private and secretive tribunal for future loss of profits, among many other things. And so we have governments actually being scared during this time of pandemic of taking the necessary steps and action because of how much power that multinational corporations have actually been given through all of these trade and investment regime, as well as many of the other systems that some colleagues earlier have actually shared about. And I think it's also really ironic how some of even these economic multilateral systems can sometimes also be incomplete, contradictory, or actually canceling each other out. There is, of course, a very good example of Pakistan, who last year lost an investor-state dispute settlement cases and was ordered to pay $5.9 billion to a Chilean and Canadian mining multinational corporation. And the $5.9 billion of damages that they have to pay for losing that ISDS case is just 0.1 billion short from the $6 billion IMF bailout loan that the same Pakistani government is taking from the IMF for the next 3 years. And so any kind of imaginary impact that we can imagine the IMF bailout package can possibly bring to the government of Pakistan or the country of Pakistan, which Emma has, clearly put forth would not really, given all of its conditionality, is already getting cancelled out by this massive amount of money that the Pakistani government will also have to pay to a multinational corporations. And so that is also partly why, for many of us who work in the trade space, we have this World Trade Organization, which was already in crisis before the pandemic, has now gone into a complete, absolute existential crisis, for lack of a better word, post or currently as we go through the pandemic, because it has shown that as government espoused the whole narrative of free trade and so forth, the moment the pandemic hits, every government, including many developed governments and developed countries who have been pushing for all of these trade rules on developing countries, are the first one to enter into, taking up all kinds of unilateral measures as well as steps. And so when we hear a lot of people say over and over again how the multilateralism is in crisis, I personally think that is very true. It is in crisis for many of the number of reasons that we have heard earlier from many of the speakers, and for many of the reasons that I think many of the movements around the world have also been articulating as we work and engage in many of these different spaces. And so a fix to this multilateral system can't be something that's band-aid, or can't be something that is simply symptomatic. We do need a whole system fix. And we've been, like, us panelists have effectively been given this sort of momentous task to, get some ideas and thoughts on what re-envisioning this whole new multilateralism can look like. And to be perfectly honest, I think many of you also have some of those answers and some of those ideas as well, with all the wealth of experiences that many of you have from working within these different multilateral spaces. And of course, I do also echo and am very much in solidarity with many of the other movements and colleagues as well as activists in, on the numerous calls that has actually been put forth. We heard earlier on the call for a UN Economic Reconstruction and Systemic Reform Summit, the tax body, as well as the debt workout mechanism. And for the trade groups, there's been numerous calls in putting a halt to all of the trade negotiations that has actually continued even as governments are struggling to handle the pandemic. We see many of these negotiations have not actually been put on halt. A broad overarching call to really just dismantle the entire investor-state dispute settlement system, which has given corporations so much power. And of course, number of other calls that we've heard many of the colleagues sharing earlier, right? And I think it's really going to be, I come from the Asia Pacific region, where a couple of years ago, we as a movement came together and wanted to talk about and articulate our own vision of an alternative model for development, one that wasn't based on economic growth, one that was not based on trickle-down economic policies, right? And so we came together. It was not easy, but we came together across different movements and across different countries to try and put together what some of those alternatives are. And they're not necessarily new, because many of it are areas that people are working on, and it's just a question of like bringing all those different movements and different issues together. And so I think it's really going to be interesting for us as a movement as well. And I do really strongly believe in the power of movement, having been from the feminist movement myself and having seen of the power that women's movement have been able to show over the past decades, and within the trade domain as well, to recognize that part of the existential crisis that the WTO has hit is partly because of the consistent effort, resistance, and struggles from different movements around the world that it has hit this current point where it is currently at. That really sort of like illustrate to me the need for us to really come together to do that envisioning and reimagining process, which will probably take a while, but where we can imagine a multilateral system where the primacy of human rights sits at the top and takes precedence over everything else, especially, of course, economic growth, and one that's based on solidarity, cooperation, and exchanges, not just between states, which we also do want to see, but also between movements, between countries, transnationally. And so there is a huge momentous task ahead of us, but I'm going to be end this on a slightly more optimistic and positive note, in that I do think that we can do this momentous task, and that we don't have any other choice than to carry out this momentous task, because if we don't, the future that we live in post this pandemic is not going to be shaped by us. It's going to be shaped by the political and economic elites who are already, moving behind the scene, or maybe in some cases not even behind the scene. If you talk about Bill Gates, really trying to shape what this world will look like post this pandemic. So I'm going to end with that.
Thank you so much, Diana, for really leaving us on a good note. I think that all of you have expressed the challenges that each of these processes presents. I want to bring in the panelists and just highlight some questions. And what I'll do is I'll work back and direct to Stefano, and then Emma, and then Alejandra. So the challenges that we're hearing seem to be staggering, and I liked your closing there, Diana, because I think that Stefano has put it quite well in saying that we are in the age of resistance. I would agree. People in the chat, in our YouTube, have raised a number of questions and comments. One of them from Nancy: are there rays of hope? So I want to go back to Stefano and to ask, what are some of the recommendations you may have in terms of countering not only the G20 mission creep and really optimizing this crisis, as someone said, there's never let a good crisis go to waste approach, but not only within the G20, but really looking at different spaces and trying to maximize not the primacy of market and capital and free movement of capital, but really the primacy of a human centered development and human rights. Stefano.
Thanks, Rosa. I think there are many rays of hope in the sense that, and we see them in the way in which our people, our communities are responding, to the circumstances with incredible resilience and imagination. That's for me as where the hope is. But the problem is that we need to, we have a fundamental challenge in the way in which we organize. We need to stop chasing institutions and their meetings. And we need to start really thinking about creating a multi-layered, well-organized resistance struggle that can confront power. And that means confronting a number of challenges. First of all, confronting our challenge for leadership. Where is the leadership coming from? I mean, we continue to be locked into technical-based advocacy for, whatever happens in September and October and things like this. And rather than really building a movement that is led by our southern constituencies, by our social movements, by our workers, by indigenous people, small-scale food producers, and therefore really ensuring that the leadership comes where it needs to come from, rather than reproducing within civil society the same dynamics of power that we try to contrast within the formal space. We also need to clarify our politics. Many of our messages are now dramatically close to the sovereignist agendas that promote the mostly trapped by right-wing agendas. How is our call for sovereignty in terms of greater policy, fiscal, judicial space, freedom from conditionality and so forth is different from that? It's different from that because it is also combined with a much stronger call for solidarity and cooperation centered on human rights to manage our global commons. But very often that is very marginal when we confront our movements locally. And there is an increasing tension between the local and the global. A lot of resistance movement, particularly social movement, tend to be anti-globalist by nature. While very often the roots of the problem that they confront locally are actually globally. So it's difficult now to disentangle the local from the global. Now, I don't have time to elaborate on all of this, but the whole point is that maybe we should stop focusing into looking at institutions and their agendas and really try and build a cross-national, global, local, global, cross-sectoral movement to contrast power. Without that, I don't think we stand a chance. So for me, the ray of hope is thinking that this can happen as long as we stop focusing on the wrong agendas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to go to Emma, and I know that we asked about the work that you were doing on furthering the work of women's groups and feminist groups within the IMF in particular. But if you can try to let us know about this work, but also incorporate, how can the movement of the bank and IMF watchers expand and collaborate with some of these other movements in really furthering, as Stefano was saying, our search for coherence and collective movement building around this resistance.
Yes, thank you very much, Rosa. So it's hard to answer that question and not do what Stefano just said not to do. But so I mean, I cannot agree more with what Stefano is saying. I think that from where I'm sitting, working on the fund and bank, we are really missing this this movement and this coordination between civil society groups that isn't, based or segregated in these various fora. So, for example, someone asked me recently, Emma, what are the proposals, or what would it look like to build a feminist multilateralism and a economic global architecture that would center care in the economy? And actually, I don't think, I've seen a lot of work, of course, on care, but when you ask these questions about decision making at the global level, I don't think I've seen, much movement or work or proposals around that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do, and there are some very, I think, transformative proposals on the table that we talked about in terms of tax and debt, and something that came out of the global financial crisis in the Stiglitz report was the idea to create a different, separate global reserve currency that wouldn't be the IMF's SDR. And, that's another way in which I think the way to really look at it is to consider these institutions and all the different functions that they hold, and slowly tear that apart and slowly bring up other alternatives and fight for them. That at least seems to me like what has a lot of momentum right now, and something we can organize around. But to answer your question, if we are talking about this sort of damage control, and in this very moment, especially now with COVID, when so many decisions are being taken, what some of that like damage control work looks like. So unlike when we're talking about development finance, where the loan really goes to a specific project, the type of financing the IMF does, right? It's not linked to anything specific that the money needs to be spent on. It's just in return for these macroeconomic policy changes. And at the moment, the IMF has zero system in place for assessing the impacts of those macroeconomic policy reforms. So it's such a really basic thing to ask for gender and economic inequality impact assessments. So that's been something that has slowly been moving forward, that discussion inside the fund that some women's groups are having with them. But yeah, it's important. It's really important for groups that do that kind of work to be really clear that that isn't going to lead to the transformative change we're ultimately all looking for. And so you can do that kind of work, but at the same time, you have to have these larger discussions away from these institutions, right? And just to pick up on what Stefano was saying on the conflict, the sort of conflicting, murky sort of environment that this artificial separation of fora creates. Some of you might know that in the Human Rights Council, I think it was last year, there was guiding principles adopted on human rights impact assessments of macroeconomic reforms. And when the Human Rights Council adopted it, they specifically said they recommended international finance institutions and UN specialized agencies like the World Bank and IMF take up that guidance. The same government that said that in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, when asked about it then in Washington, had absolutely nothing to say about it. You know what I mean? So this artificial separation is letting them get away with not doing anything. So I agree. We need to organize ourselves in that way as well.
Indeed. Thank you, Emma. Coming to you, Alejandra, I mean, same question, but, you and I have shared the work of a global campaign back in 2005, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which really brought a lot of these same issues. It seems like we are in the same space, that was a global campaign that began with the G7 meeting in Gleneagles, moving to the UN summit, and then to the WTO at the end of that year. You have that insight and that background, and you also are moving into this new space. What can you offer in terms of words of how to bring the movements together and organizing and mobilizing?
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you for all the wonderful and also critical, but also inspiring presentations. The first thing that I would like to say is that this is a very complex time, right? So the COVID-19 crisis has exposed inequalities, injustices, but as Stefano was saying that some of us were hoping that this was the end of capitalism, and we are already seeing that this is not the case, right? So complex situations will lead to complex also solutions. It's not an easy answer what we have in front of us. The good news is, as you are saying, Rosa, we are not departing from zero. It's not the first time that feminist movements, want to, stretch arms and outreach unions and outreach academies and outreach UN agencies. We have a long history of working together. And as Stefano was saying, it's also a time to look at our own politics and ways of working. I would like to reiterate my comment about the opportunity when these processes come, like, as Stefano was saying, October meeting. Well, we have the opportunity of a new draft of the binding instrument, right? That really is creating a new law to hold corporate power and corporate influence over states, over decision making. So I would like to invite you to read this new draft, to also connect with your governments, and to really help us educate, at local and national level about this process. I think that if COVID has shown us something, COVID-19, is that responses have come from the territories, have come from the local communities. I mean, most of the people are saying in webinars, in lots of dialogues, that if it hasn't been from the resilience, knowledge, and solidarity of the communities, many of the people, that were in more vulnerable situations would not be, safe today. If it hasn't been for the, the knowledge, the networking, the capacity of the networks and of the, what we have, the power of the movements. So more than ever, we know that our global work needs to be rooted in the local communities. And this is why I also commented on the work of the communities in Sonora. They are the ones that are also, being supported by Poder and by many other networks at national level, because if we don't do that global, local, and local to global translation, changes will not happen. So I want to reiterate the opportunity of this umbrella that the binding instrument provides us to really, connect with groups working on workers' rights, on taxing corporate power, on the ones working on feminist analysis. This is an opportunity. And of course, we need to also extend this process to other UN spaces and more autonomous spaces of dialogue. But I think that it's time for more collaboration, solidarity, and rooting our global work in the local responses and local knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just want to highlight some comments in the chat that people have put. The latest is a question on the by Nancy Kachingwe. Thanks, Nancy. To all panelists, now this is a call for another webinar, really. We need to talk about the World Economic Forum and its role, as a new space for re-engineering a new global order. I mean, that you're calling for a new webinar, Nancy. Thank you. Because we're at minute 24 with 6 minutes left. Also, Francis Zinedine saying movements can make a big noise, but to be effective, there must be some structures to develop strategy and next steps. Otherwise, resistance is lost and fails. There are also questions about the IFIs, which, you know, I would hope that our panelists can reply to some of this. Nilanjana talks about this G20's mission creep, and how we need to interrogate how civil society has contributed to the legitimization of the G20 and how we walk away. I think Stefano has highlighted some of those points. I want to come to Dijana for some closing remarks as a respondent, and pulling some of these responses together. Maybe you can bring in some of the knowledge from the work that you've done around developmental justice in the global South. Diana, a couple more minutes, and then I think we're going to have to be closing shortly.
Oh, wow. I mean, I have another momentous task to do this closing
I mean,
part.
I think we all do, indeed, all of us, in that sense.
Yes, we do indeed. And I think I can't imagine a better group and even a better set of panelists to be having this momentous task with and to be taking this forward as well. I think, like, firstly, as I mentioned, in the Asia Pacific region, we had a couple of years back try to come together and, you know, articulate our own vision for alternative development. And I think, as many before has mentioned, you know, movements, whether they be feminists or other movements as well, we do have a vision of what kind of world we want to live in. That would be better for us, that would protect our rights, that would ensure equality, you know, between and across countries, rich and poor, men and women, and communities as well. And so there is, I think, certainly a wealth of knowledge and ideas that movements have built and have shown over the years. And I think what we need to do basically is just figure out a way to bring many of those together in addressing all of these different architectures that has so much profound impact on all of our lives, whether they be economy, human rights, social, and so forth, right? And then the question is, and I don't honestly have the answer for that, is how do we bring all of that together, right? And I have been thinking, you know, recently, or in the last year or so, especially in observing what has been going on within the trade multilateral system and the World Trade Organization. And part of what a lot of the movements that I'm part of and working in the Asia Pacific region has been positioned as that we don't really need the World Trade Organization in order for country to trade, because the World Trade rules and policies aren't actually about trading, and countries have been trading across border, or communities have been trading across border for decades and centuries before any trade and investment treaties and regime had to be put in place, right? And so there's a lot of these, you know, fallacies about why we need this institution, which aren't actually entirely true, because you don't need the WTO to trade. You don't need an investment agreement or treaties either to attract foreign direct investment, if that is indeed the goal of a country. And I don't know if we even need, you know, I think Emma has clearly illustrated, the World Bank and the IMF to actually get any kind of development, right? And so a lot of these institutions are built on like false idea why they need to exist, when effectively many of you and many of us have done enough work to show that actually you don't have to exist. And if you didn't exist tomorrow, we would also be fine, or perhaps we would have less problem to deal with. So I think that's my first kind of point. And then my second point really is that, my second and final point really is that I do agree that a lot of the criticism on the multilateral system, which is echoed by many right-wing movements and nationalist authoritarian rulers at national and local level, are similar, and there's no denying that to some extent. And at the same time, those criticisms are very true, because many of us have been articulating that, right? But I think one of the things that we need to really be putting forth and really coming together as progressive movement is what differentiate that criticism that we have, which is legitimate and which is true, is that we are not proposing to make away with multilateralism. We don't mean that we don't need multilateralism. We do believe we need multilateralism. It's just that we need a different form or a different mode or a new kind of multilateralism. And so the question for us, and the momentous task for us, and maybe this is another webinar as well, Rosa and Emilia, is how do we imagine and how do we shape that new multilateralism for many, many years to come and for many generations to come.
Thank you so much. I think that really, yes. Thank you all to all the panelists. Let me just cheer everybody on right now, because I know Stefano might not have to leave any moment. Thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you all. But let me just quickly thank you, Diana, for that closing note. I think it's so important to think positively and to the future. This set of webinars are action-oriented solution-building platforms, really, for us. You have given us so much food for thought. It will be our great task to distill from this webinar, and I invite all our listeners here also to help in really distilling this precious information, gems of information about how to go forward. I think that it was very words of lots of challenge, but also lots of hope. And I think also one of the things we want to go away from is some of these encapsulated thoughts and hashtags. Hashtag age of resistance now. Hashtag another normal is possible. Hashtag looking for solutions from the territories. And I think from the global south and leading us on, I think that would need to be devoted a lot of time to do it. And I want to highlight that work is on the way. As I mentioned earlier, we have launched UN Economic Reconstruction and Systemic Reform Summit. We are actively working, calling for an overarching principles, human rights, gender equality, well-being and social, economic, and environmental justice, social economic transformation, a just, equitable transition for people on the planet, and the democratization of global economic governance and inclusive participation at all levels, all of which we have discussed and highlighted here. So in closing, I want to thank our fabulous panel. Thank you so much, Alejandra, Emma, Diana, and Stefano, and Emilia in the background. Thank you so much. I want to give a big shout out to our Equidad de Género and Feminist Task Force technical team. You are fabulous. Los queremos mucho. And to highlight that our next webinar, we are taking a health break. Our next webinar has been now changed to September 14th, which sort of begins the process at the UN of the UNGA, and we will be looking at corporate capture, financialization, and financial extractivism. So please join us, and all of you here are on our listserv. So thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, be well, and organize. Thank you.